The moment someone starts treating your land like their shortcut, they have already decided your rights do not matter. The sound hit me before I even opened my eyes. It was not the steady creak of the old windmill or the familiar low calls of cattle waiting for the morning feed. It was the deep rumble of multiple engines pushing hard across ground where no vehicle had any business being. I grabbed my coffee and stepped onto the porch just as the first streaks of sunrise painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and orange. 5 shiny sport utility vehicles burst over the small rise beyond my fence line, rolling across my pasture as if they were driving through a public park instead of private ranch land that my family had cared for over 3 generations. My name is Logan Brooks, and I have spent my entire life protecting this ranch. Every fence post, every patch of grass, every watering trough, and every acre of pasture exists because someone in my family invested years of sweat into keeping this place alive. My grandfather built the original barn with his own hands after returning home from the war. My father taught me that land does not belong to us forever. We simply take care of it long enough to pass it on better than we found it. Watching those 5 vehicles leave fresh tire marks across healthy, grazing land felt like someone had walked into my living room wearing muddy boots and decided the furniture belonged to them. At first, I honestly believed they were lost. The county road sat less than half a mile away and connected directly to the highway. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to drive through my ranch unless they deliberately wanted a shortcut. Then the lead vehicle slowed near my eastern pasture before turning with complete confidence toward the western boundary, and every vehicle behind it followed the exact same path. That was the moment I realized this was not a mistake. This was routine. I climbed into my pickup and drove toward the highest ridge overlooking the pasture. From there, I pulled a compact survey drone from the storage case behind my seat and launched it into the cool morning air. The drone climbed smoothly above the ranch, while its camera streamed crystal clear video directly onto the controller in my hands. From above, everything became obvious. The 5 vehicles had entered through an opening near the property line bordering Willow Ridge Estates, crossed directly over one of my managed grazing fields, and continued toward the county road on the opposite side without slowing once. They were not hiding. They were laughing with their windows open, pointing toward the highway ahead as though this route belonged to them. The drone quietly recorded every second while I stood alone beside the weathered fence posts my father had repaired countless times before handing the ranch to me. Beyond the pasture, I could see the neatly landscaped neighborhood waking up beneath the morning sun, while below me fresh tire tracks carved across grass that had spent months recovering after a difficult summer. As I lowered the drone and looked back across the eastern boundary, something deep inside told me this was only the beginning. Because people who grow comfortable crossing one boundary rarely stop until someone finally reminds them where that boundary has always been. After the vehicles disappeared beyond the western fence line, I walked the entire path they had taken instead of climbing back into my truck. Fresh tire marks pressed deep into the pasture, flattening healthy grass that had taken months to recover after one of the driest summers the first could remember. Most people look at an open field and see empty space, but every acre of this ranch has a purpose. Some sections rest while others support grazing, some protect natural drainage, and some are carefully managed so the soil stays healthy year after year. My father taught me to read Pasture the same way other people read books. He could tell where rainwater flowed after a storm, where cattle preferred to graze, and where heavy equipment should never travel unless absolutely necessary. Long before this ranch officially became mine, he reminded me that protecting land rarely meant doing something dramatic. Most of the time it meant paying attention to small details before they became expensive problems. As I followed the tire tracks, I noticed they crossed directly through a section of pasture scheduled for drainage improvements later that month. The previous winter had exposed a slow drainage problem near the eastern boundary, and after consulting with agricultural specialists, I hired a civil engineering company to evaluate the area before beginning permanent repairs. Several bright orange survey stakes already marked portions of the field where engineers planned to perform soil testing. At first, those markers had seemed like nothing more than another maintenance project among countless others that come with running a working ranch. Looking at them now, I realized they represented something much more important. They marked an area that required careful planning, accurate measurements, and professional oversight, not daily traffic from people looking for a faster drive home. When I returned to the ranch house, I downloaded the drone footage onto my computer and enlarged the aerial images. The recording revealed something that bothered me even more than the damaged grass. Every vehicle followed nearly the exact same route across my property. There was no hesitation, no searching for directions, and no sign that anyone believed they were making a mistake. They entered through a gap used only by ranch equipment, crossed the pasture in a smooth line, and exited toward the county road with the confidence of people who had probably done it before. That confidence told me everything I needed to know. This was not one careless morning. It was a habit. Before shutting down my computer, I copied every video onto 2 external hard drives and synchronized the recording times with the security cameras mounted near the eastern fence. Those cameras had originally been installed to monitor livestock and equipment, but now they had captured something far more valuable than routine ranch activity. As evenings settled over the pasture, golden sunlight stretched across the same fresh tire tracks that had caught my attention at sunrise. Beyond the property line, Willow Ridge Estates looked peaceful beneath the fading light, with porch lights beginning to glow as families returned home. Standing beside the weathered fence that had marked my family's eastern boundary for decades, I had the uneasy feeling that those tracks would not be the last ones I would find. Something told me the people using my ranch as their private shortcut had grown far too comfortable believing nobody would ever challenge them, and I quietly decided that if this continued, I would let patience and evidence speak long before I ever raised my voice. 2 days later, I drove into Willow Ridge Estates carrying nothing more than a folder filled with printed photographs from my drone and still images from my ranch security cameras. The neighborhood looked exactly the way it always had from the air. Freshly mowed lawns stretched along quiet streets. Decorative stone entrance signs stood beside colorful flower beds, and every house looked carefully maintained. It was the kind of place where people clearly took pride in appearances, which made what had been happening on the other side of the property line even harder to understand. Inside the Homeowners Association office, I introduced myself and asked if I could speak with the association president. A few minutes later, Melissa Grant walked into the conference room, wearing a tailored navy blazer and carrying a tablet. She greeted me politely with the confident smile of someone accustomed to solving neighborhood concerns. I thanked her for meeting with me and explained that my ranch bordered the eastern edge of the community. Then I placed the aerial photographs across the table one by one. The images showed 5 sport utility vehicles leaving the neighborhood, entering my property through the equipment opening near the fence, crossing active grazing pasture, and exiting toward the county road. Melissa studied the photographs for several seconds before looking back at me. She admitted she recognized the vehicles and casually explained that some residents preferred that route because it saved several minutes during busy mornings. She described it as an informal shortcut that people had been using for a while and suggested they probably assumed the open pasture was not causing any real problems. I calmly explained that the land was an active working ranch, not vacant property. Every pasture rotation, drainage channel, irrigation line, and grazing section existed for a reason. I also told her that civil engineers were preparing to begin soil evaluations near the eastern boundary because a drainage improvement project had already been scheduled. Bright survey stakes had been installed, and additional engineering work would begin soon. I asked only one thing. Please let your residents know the shortcut crossed private property and needed to stop immediately. Melissa nodded politely, but her expression suggested she still believed the situation was being exaggerated. She remarked that a few tire tracks across such a large ranch hardly seemed serious and assured me she would mention the issue during the next homeowners association meeting. I thanked her for her time, gathered my photographs, and left without raising my voice because I genuinely hoped a respectful conversation would solve everything. Unfortunately, that hope lasted less than 48 hours. Early Saturday morning, I heard the same familiar rumble echo across the pasture once again. This time I was already standing on the eastern ridge with my drone prepared for flight before the first vehicle appeared. One by one, the same 5 sport utility vehicles emerged from the neighborhood entrance and rolled toward the opening in my fence exactly as before. Through the live camera feed, I immediately recognized Melissa driving the lead vehicle while 4 friends followed closely behind her. They passed the bright orange survey stakes without slowing, laughed with their windows open, and continued across the pasture with the confidence of people who believed nobody would ever stop them. Watching that live video unfold in front of me, I finally understood that this had never been about misunderstanding. It was about a deliberate choice to place convenience above someone else's property rights. And from that moment forward, I knew facts, documentation, and patience would have to finish the conversation that simple courtesy could not. After watching the drone footage that Saturday morning, I stopped thinking about convincing anyone and started thinking about documenting everything so thoroughly that no one could ever question what had happened. My father used to tell me that the loudest person rarely wins an argument, but the person who quietly keeps every record usually does. Those words stayed with me as I called my attorney later that afternoon and explained the entire situation from the beginning. I emailed him the drone recordings, security camera footage, photographs of the tire tracks, and copies of the survey documents already prepared by the engineering company. We spent nearly an hour reviewing every image together. The videos clearly showed the same vehicles following the identical route across my pasture on multiple mornings, including the recording of my meeting with Melissa documented through dated notes and follow-up emails. When we finished reviewing everything, he advised me not to confront anyone again. Instead, he recommended allowing the engineering project to continue exactly as planned while preserving every piece of evidence in chronological order. The following morning, I met with the lead civil engineer near the eastern pasture where bright orange survey stakes already marked the future drainage improvements. He walked the property with me, carefully examining the repeated tire tracks crossing the planned work zone. He explained that years of seasonal runoff had weakened sections of the underlying soil and that additional geotechnical testing needed to begin before permanent stabilization work could safely move forward. Heavy unauthorized vehicle traffic through that area could interfere with soil measurements, damage survey markers, and delay construction. After reviewing the situation, the engineering company decided to accelerate the preparation schedule. Temporary construction fencing would be installed around the testing area, larger reflective warning signs would be placed at every possible vehicle entry point, and additional safety barriers would clearly identify the restricted work zone. Everything would be completed according to county regulations and documented with dated photographs before each workday began. 2 days later, the eastern pasture looked completely different. Bright orange fencing outlined the engineering area, warning signs faced every direction, and clearly visible notices identified the location as an active work zone with restricted vehicle access. Even from several hundred yards away, the sign stood out against the green pasture beneath the Texas sun. That afternoon, a county inspector arrived to review the site before testing officially began. He walked the perimeter with the engineering supervisor, confirmed the temporary barriers matched the approved plans, photographed every warning sign, and signed the inspection report before leaving. Watching that process gave me an unexpected sense of confidence because every important step was now being verified by professionals completely independent of me. Before sunset, I installed 2 additional security cameras overlooking the eastern boundary and programmed my drone to perform routine morning inspections whenever weather conditions allowed. Every photograph, every video, every inspection report, every engineering document, and every email was copied onto multiple storage drives and organized by date. Looking across the quiet pasture as the evening light settled over the fresh grass, I realized something had changed inside me. I was no longer waiting for the next confrontation. I was simply waiting to see whether people who had ignored courtesy would also ignore clear warnings, official barriers, and the unmistakable boundaries that had now been placed directly in front of them. The engineering crew arrived just after sunrise on Monday, and by noon the eastern pasture looked more like a carefully managed work site than an open grazing field. Every temporary fence section stood exactly where the approved site plan required. Bright orange safety mesh stretched between steel posts driven deep into the ground, while reflective warning signs faced every possible direction a vehicle could approach. Large black lettering announced that the area was an active engineering survey zone with restricted access and unstable ground under evaluation. Additional notices instructed all unauthorized vehicles to remain outside the marked boundaries. Nothing about the setup was hidden or confusing. In fact, the signs could easily be seen from several hundred feet away, especially against the green pasture beneath the clear blue Texas sky. Throughout the morning, Survey crews walked methodically across the field carrying measuring equipment, marking reference points, and recording elevation data that would later guide the drainage improvements. Every activity followed a written schedule that had already been reviewed by the county inspector. I spent most of the day helping move cattle into a neighboring pasture so the engineers could work without interruption, occasionally glancing toward the eastern boundary where the temporary fencing now formed an unmistakable line separating the work zone from the rest of the ranch. Late that afternoon, the lead engineer invited me to review the preliminary findings. He explained that several sections of soil near the drainage channel contained unusually high moisture below the surface. Although the grass looked healthy from above, the ground underneath had become soft after months of trapped groundwater, making the area unsuitable for regular vehicle traffic until stabilization work could be completed. That confirmation only reinforced why unauthorized driving through the pasture had become such a serious concern. Before leaving for the day, the engineering supervisor photographed every warning sign, every barrier, and every survey marker from multiple angles before uploading the images into the project file. I appreciated that level of professionalism because it created another independent record showing the condition of the property before additional testing began. Early the next morning, I performed my usual drone inspection shortly after dawn. The temporary fencing remained intact, the warning signs stood exactly where they had been installed, and the survey crews had not yet arrived. The ranch was quiet except for birds moving across the pasture and a light breeze rustling through the grass. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe the message had finally been understood. Perhaps seeing official barriers and engineering equipment had convinced everyone to use the county road instead. That thought lasted only a few minutes. As the drone continued its slow patrol above the eastern boundary, 5 familiar sport utility vehicles appeared at the edge of Willow Ridge Estates. Instead of slowing down when they reached the clearly marked entrance, the lead vehicle paused only long enough for the driver to look directly at the warning signs before steering toward the narrow opening beside the temporary fencing. One after another, the remaining vehicles followed with the same confidence I had seen before. From the live video feed, I watched them deliberately pass every notice, every barrier, and every visible indication that the pasture ahead had become an active engineering site. Standing alone beneath the rising morning sun with the drone controller in my hands, I realized the next few minutes would answer a question that weeks of conversations never could, because there comes a point when every decision is made with full knowledge of the consequences, and I had a feeling that moment had finally arrived. From the drone hovering above the eastern pasture, I watched the lead sport utility vehicle ease around the temporary fencing instead of stopping in front of it. The driver had more than enough room to turn around and return to the county road, but that opportunity disappeared the moment the front wheels rolled beyond the last warning sign. The remaining 4 vehicles followed in a slow line, weaving carefully between survey stakes as though the barriers were nothing more than minor inconveniences. Every movement unfolded in sharp detail across the controller screen in my hands. The bright orange fencing remained untouched. The reflective warning signs stood exactly where they had been photographed the previous afternoon, and the engineering markers clearly outlined the restricted testing area. There could be no misunderstanding about where they were or why they should not be there. Within seconds, the lead vehicle reached the section of pasture where engineers had identified unusually soft subsurface conditions. At first, nothing appeared unusual. The tires rolled across the grass, just as they had on previous mornings. Then the front end settled slightly lower. The driver stopped for a moment before pressing the accelerator again. Instead of moving forward, the tires spun gently against the damp soil beneath the surface, and the vehicle sank several more inches until the frame rested against the soft ground. One after another, the drivers behind attempted to maneuver around it, only to discover that the surrounding area had the same unstable conditions documented by the engineering survey. Each vehicle quickly lost traction and settled into the saturated soil until all 5 sat motionless inside the marked work zone. No collision occurred, no one was injured, and no panic followed. The driver stepped out, looked around at the warning signs they had just passed, and quietly realized that leaving would require professional recovery equipment rather than more throttle. I remained where I was and immediately called the engineering supervisor, who instructed every crew member to stay clear until the area could be evaluated for safety. A few minutes later, I contacted the county office to report that unauthorized vehicles had entered the active survey site despite the posted restrictions. While waiting for officials to arrive, my drone continued recording uninterrupted overhead footage that captured every entrance, every visible warning sign, every survey marker, and every attempt the drivers made before eventually giving up. When the engineering supervisor reached the pasture, he walked only along the approved access path before documenting the position of each vehicle with photographs and survey notes. Shortly afterward, the county inspector arrived carrying the same inspection file he had signed the day before. He slowly examined the barriers, compared the scene with the official site photographs already on record, and confirmed that every required warning remained fully visible before the vehicles entered the restricted area. By the time a heavy recovery truck reached the ranch later that morning, the story had already been preserved from every possible angle. Drone footage, security cameras, engineering documentation, inspection reports, timestamps, and photographs all matched perfectly. Standing beside the fence while the recovery crew carefully prepared to remove the stranded vehicles without disturbing the survey area any further, I realized I had never needed to prove anyone wrong. I only needed to make certain that when the truth finally arrived, it would be impossible for anyone to argue with it. By late afternoon, the pasture had grown quiet again, but the work inside my office was only beginning. I spread every document across the large wooden table my grandfather had built decades earlier. On one side sat printed aerial photographs captured by my drone. Next to them were security camera images stamped with exact dates and times. Beside those rested the engineering reports describing the soil conditions, the county inspection forms confirming the warning signs had been properly installed, and the photographs taken before the survey work officially began. Looking across that table, I realized every piece fit together like parts of the same puzzle. None of it depended on my opinion. Every conclusion came from independent evidence created by professionals doing their jobs. My attorney arrived the following morning carrying a laptop and several legal folders. We spent hours reviewing the timeline minute by minute. The first recordings showed repeated unauthorized crossings weeks earlier. Then came my meeting with Melissa, followed by dated emails summarizing our conversation. After that were the engineering contracts, the survey schedule, photographs documenting the installation of temporary fencing, the county inspection completed before testing began, and finally the uninterrupted drone footage showing the 5 vehicles bypassing every visible warning before entering the restricted work zone. There were no missing pieces and no unexplained gaps. Everything followed a clear sequence supported by timestamps from multiple independent sources. Later that afternoon, representatives from the Homeowners Association contacted my attorney requesting copies of the evidence before their emergency board meeting. Rather than arguing through phone calls or exchanging accusations, we simply organized the files into chronological order and delivered exactly what had been requested. A few days later, I learned what happened during that meeting. After reviewing the complete timeline, several board members acknowledged that the engineering site had been properly marked, the barriers had complied with county requirements, and the drivers had entered the restricted area despite numerous visible warnings. Even the recovery company documented that the vehicles had required specialized equipment because the ground conditions matched the engineering survey completed before the incident. Those reports became yet another independent confirmation supporting everything already recorded. Melissa eventually requested another meeting, but this time the conversation felt completely different from our first discussion. She no longer questioned whether the pasture belonged to me or whether residents had been using it as a shortcut. Instead, she asked for copies of the property boundary map and the engineering schedule so the association could notify every homeowner that the ranch was private property and that future access across the eastern boundary was prohibited. I appreciated that change because it meant the discussion had finally moved away from opinions and toward facts. Before leaving, she quietly admitted that convenience had influenced several poor decisions and acknowledged that my original request had been both reasonable and respectful. I accepted her apology without celebrating because proving someone wrong had never been my goal. Protecting the ranch had always mattered far more than winning an argument. As the sun settled behind the western hills that evening, I walked once again to the same weathered fence where this entire situation had begun. The orange engineering fencing still surrounded the survey area, The warning signs remained firmly in place, and fresh grass continued growing around the edges of the temporary work zone. Looking across the peaceful pasture, I understood something my father had tried to teach me years before. Evidence has a quiet kind of strength. It never raises its voice, never loses its temper, and never needs dramatic words to make its point. When enough truth is gathered with enough patience, even the loudest disagreement eventually becomes impossible to sustain. Over the next several weeks, the atmosphere around the ranch changed in ways I had not expected. Instead of hearing engines crossing the pasture before sunrise, I heard nothing except the familiar sounds that had always belonged there. Cattle moved quietly between grazing sections, meadowlarks returned to the fence posts, and the steady breeze carried the scent of fresh grass instead of exhaust. The engineering crews continued their work without interruption, completing the soil analysis and beginning the drainage improvements exactly according to schedule. Every survey stake remained undisturbed, every temporary barrier stayed in place, and not a single unauthorized vehicle entered the work zone again. My attorney called one Friday afternoon with the final update I had been waiting for. The Homeowners Association had officially withdrawn every complaint connected to the incident and had circulated a written notice reminding all residents that the ranch was private property. The notice included a clearly marked property map, instructions directing drivers to remain on public roads, and a statement explaining that the engineering project involved restricted access areas that could not be entered without permission. A few days later, the county office sent me copies of the completed inspection reports confirming that the temporary work zone had remained in compliance throughout the entire project. Reading those documents brought a quiet sense of closure because they reflected exactly what I had believed from the beginning. The situation had never been complicated. Private property deserved respect, visible warnings deserved attention, and established boundaries existed for a reason. About a week later, I ran into Melissa at the local farm supply store. The conversation felt completely different from our first meeting inside the Homeowners Association office. There was no defensiveness and no attempt to minimize what had happened. She told me the board had spent considerable time reviewing the footage and engineering records and admitted that seeing every event unfold in chronological order had changed several opinions. She also mentioned that the association had decided to install additional directional signs inside the neighborhood so residents would naturally follow the county road instead of looking for informal shortcuts across neighboring land. I thanked her for making that decision because it protected both the community and the ranch. Before we went our separate ways, she quietly acknowledged that my patience had probably prevented the situation from becoming much more difficult for everyone involved. Driving home that afternoon, I realized I had never once celebrated the fact that the vehicles became stranded inside the engineering survey area. What mattered far more was everything that happened afterward. Professionals had done their jobs, official records had been preserved, facts had replaced assumptions, and a long-standing problem had finally come to an end without unnecessary conflict. As autumn gradually settled across the ranch, the temporary construction fencing was replaced with permanent drainage improvements and a stronger section of boundary fencing near the eastern property line. Fresh grass slowly covered the last visible tire marks, leaving almost no reminder that dozens of unauthorized crossings had once scarred that pasture. Standing beside the completed fence one cool evening, while the sun disappeared behind the western hills, I looked toward Willow Ridge Estates and noticed that every vehicle leaving the neighborhood now turned onto the county road exactly as it should. There were no shortcuts anymore, no arguments left to settle, and no reason for anyone to question where the boundary stood. Sometimes the strongest victory is not watching someone lose. Sometimes it is simply watching everyone finally choose to do the right thing because the truth has become too clear to ignore. Several months have passed since that quiet morning when I stood beside the eastern fence watching the first sunlight spread across the pasture. And every time I look across this ranch, I am reminded that the land always tells the truth if you are willing to pay attention. The drainage improvements are complete now. What was once a section of unstable ground has become a properly engineered system that carries rainwater safely away from the grazing fields. Fresh grass has grown thick enough that even I have trouble finding the last traces of the old tire tracks unless I know exactly where to look. The temporary orange fencing disappeared long ago, replaced by a stronger permanent fence built along the eastern boundary with clearly marked property signs placed at regular intervals. They are not there because I expect another conflict. They are there because clear boundaries prevent unnecessary misunderstandings before they ever begin. Life on the ranch has returned to the rhythm I have known since childhood. My mornings begin with checking cattle, walking fence lines, inspecting water tanks, and occasionally launching the same drone that quietly documented every important moment of this story. These days, the camera mostly captures peaceful scenes instead of evidence. Deer move through the pasture before sunrise. Hawks circle above the hay fields, and long shadows stretch across the grass exactly as they always have. Sometimes I pause the drone over the eastern property line and look toward Willow Ridge Estates. The neighborhood still looks neat and welcoming, but now every vehicle leaving the community turns onto the county road instead of crossing private land. It has become so routine that newer residents probably have no idea there was ever another path. That simple change says more than any courtroom argument or heated confrontation ever could. A few weeks ago, the engineering company mailed me the final project report along with a letter thanking me for cooperating throughout the survey and construction process. The county also closed its file after confirming that all work had been completed according to plan. I placed both documents inside the same cabinet where I still keep my grandfather's handwritten ranch records and my father's old boundary maps. Looking at those papers together made me smile because they represented 3 generations protecting the same land in different ways. My grandfather relied on hard work, my father relied on experience, and I relied on documentation, technology, and patience. The principles never changed even though the tools did. Every once in a while someone asks me whether everything that happened was worth the time and effort. My answer is always the same. It was never about proving that I was right. It was about making sure respect for private property was stronger than someone else's convenience. If I had ignored those first tire tracks, more would have followed. If I had responded with anger instead of preparation, the facts might have been lost beneath unnecessary arguments. Instead, every warning was visible, every step was documented, every professional performed their responsibility, and the truth quietly spoke for itself. Standing on the porch this evening with another cup of coffee in my hands, I watched the sun disappear beyond the western hills while the wind carried nothing but the familiar sounds of cattle and rustling grass across the pasture. I realized this ranch had taught me one more lesson that my father would have appreciated. Justice does not always arrive with raised voices or dramatic victories. Sometimes it arrives one photograph, one document, one patient decision, and one honest fact at a time until the only road left for everyone to follow is the right one.